Today, we count down the top 2 disturbing killers in history. Our first chilling story brings us face to face with Richard Trenton Chase, also dubbed the Vampire Killer of Sacramento. This young man derived pleasure from drinking human blood, and an undercover search of his house unveiled one of the most horrific scenes detectives have ever witnessed. Next up is Albert Fish. This evil man targeted innocent children, and his fascination for them led to unspeakable horrors. Not only did he commit sexual assault, but he disfigured and consumed his victims. When the law finally caught up with him, he claimed he had gone insane while committing his unspeakable acts. This episode's a dark one, so viewer discretion is advised. Every week, we count down the top 2 true crimes or dark stories from around the world. Be sure to subscribe to our channel to catch the latest episode each week. Now join us as we count down the top 2 disturbing killers in history. Number 1. Richard Trenton Chase. Richard Trenton Chase was known as the infamous Vampire Killer of Sacramento. This young man killed his victims, drank their blood, and then consumed their body parts. He had 6 known victims until law enforcement finally caught up with him in 1979. However, the roots of Chase's evil started much earlier, extending back to his childhood years. Born on May 23, 1950 in Sacramento, California, he exhibited alarming signs of the McDonald Triad during childhood, also known as the Triad of Sociopathy or the Homicidal Triad. These traits are used to identify individuals with violent tendencies. The triad compromises of cruelty to animals, an obsession with fire setting, and a persistent bedwetting, disturbing indicators that Chase displayed from the early age of 5. As he grew older, he turned to drinking alcohol and abusing drugs, including smoking marijuana and using LSD. Due to these concoctions and his pre-existing violent behaviors, he was in and out of mental institutions for most of his life. Subsequently, Chase developed hypochondria as a result of his drug and alcohol abuse. This condition deteriorated to the point where he began telling doctors that his heart had stopped beating. He even claimed that his blood was turning to powder. Due to his turbulent lifestyle, he moved out of his family home to live with friends when he was in his 20s. However, after a few months of living with him, they couldn't tolerate his odd behaviors and drug use. There were multiple instances where Chase would walk around the apartment nude, acting bizarrely. His roommates tried to convince him to move out, but he refused, ultimately leading them to leave instead. As a result, Richard was forced to move back home with his mother. When he grew paranoid that his mother was poisoning him, he had to move once again into an apartment with his father. His condition worsened there as he had no social life, no friends, or a romantic relationship. In his 20s, his vampiric tendencies began to develop when he was diagnosed with erectile dysfunction. He believed that by consuming animal blood, it would cure his ailment. And so, he soon began spending his free time capturing and killing animals for their blood. He even found joy in consuming them entirely raw. This disgusting behavior escalated further when in 1976, Chase was hospitalized for blood poisoning. Later, after being discharged and sent to a psychiatric asylum, he admitted to injecting himself with the blood of one of the rabbits that he had hunted. Upon hearing the bizarre behavior and reasoning behind it, nurses and other patients began to fear him, even giving him his first vampiric nickname, Dracula. At the asylum, Chase was also formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and still secretly continued his vampiric acts. He was caught multiple times capturing birds through the hospital window, drinking their blood, and disposing of their carcasses on windowsills. In addition to capturing birds, Chase was also found to be extracting blood from the hospital's therapy dog and then injecting it into his own body.
Doing things with small animals and birds, killing them, drinking their blood.
He needed extensive care. He was not receiving as much care as he should have gotten.
Fast forward to his release from the hospital, and things began to spiral dangerously out of control. His mother had stopped giving him his medications, and his brain seemed to dive into complete madness. One day, he was found in a field near Lake Tahoe, Nevada, naked and covered in cow's blood. Residents reported the incident to the police, but little was done, leading to his first of many heinous acts on human victims. On December 29, 1977, just months after the cow blood incident, Chase shot and killed 51-year-old father and engineer Ambrose Griffin in what seemed to be a random drive-by shooting. The police launched an extensive search for the killer, but Chase wasn't identified as the suspect, and so the case went cold. On January 23, 1978, Chase began wandering around checking random doors to see if any were unlocked. While doing so, he even ran into an old high school friend at a grocery store and asked her for a ride. Terrified by his malnourished and grimy demeanor, she refused and quickly fled. Chase continued his search until he finally found an unlocked door that belonged to a woman named Teresa Whalen, a 22-year-old pregnant mother. He entered the young woman's house through an unlocked door and encountered her as she was taking out the trash. After coming face to face with Teresa, Richard raised his pistol and then shot her 2 times. After Teresa fell to the ground, Richard fired a 3rd shot into her head, ending her life. His brutality didn't end there. He then proceeded to drag her body into the bedroom. Once there, he engaged in sexual depravity with his victim and dismembered her. He then finished his horrible crime with his signature act of drinking her blood from a yogurt cup. He vanished from the home before Teresa's husband arrived to discover the horrifying scene.
Stepped right inside the front door. There was garbage scattered on the floor and an obvious drag mark that went from the front room back into the master bedroom. There on the floor was Teresa Whalen. She was dead. She had been mutilated. Her abdominal region had been cut open.
Again, he escaped capture, but by now the FBI had become involved and they were beginning to build a profile against him. Just days after murdering Teresa, Chase then broke into the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Meredith on January 27, 1978. On that day, Evelyn was with her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David Ferriera, and had a friend visiting, Danny Meredith. After entering the home, Chase first encountered Danny Meredith in a hall and shot him point blank with his .22 caliber pistol. He then quickly moved on to the others, and as he moved through the house, he shot all of them one by one, ending their lives. The remaining details of this massacre are too gruesome to share, but what happened next involved Chase consuming part of Evelyn and her blood before fleeing the scene with young David's body. It had just so happened that a neighbor girl had knocked on the door during the crime, startling him. Chase then stole his victim's keys and car, fleeing the scene. At this juncture, the FBI knew a serial killer was at large and needed to be stopped before he struck again. A significant lead for the police came from his high school classmate that had run into him earlier at the grocery store. Following the interview with her, they discovered that Chase resided within a mile of most of the murder sites. Furthermore, his physical description and behavior aligned perfectly with their criminal profile. The police arrested Chase and then raided his apartment, and what they found was straight out of a horror movie. Authorities discovered the walls, floor, ceiling, refrigerator, and all of Chase's eating and drinking utensils soaked in blood. On the counter was the blender Chase used to make his smoothies from his disgusting crimes, and his refrigerator contained numerous body parts and organs. Worst of all, they found 22-month-old David's body, which he had taken from the crime scene. With undeniable evidence linking Chase to the heinous crimes, trials began in 1979.
The arguments were dramatic and somewhat predictable, the prosecutor emphasizing the magnitude of the crimes and the callousness of Richard Chase.
Chase pleaded not guilty with insanity as an excuse to escape justice. Fortunately, the judge declared him legally sane at the time of the murders. Finally, the vampire killer was found guilty on all 6 murder counts. And following his conviction, he began receiving medication for his mental health. However, instead of taking the drugs, he stockpiled them until he had enough to end his own life. His lifeless body was discovered in his cell in December 1979, ending the horrible chapter for the vampire killer of Sacramento.
Wednesday is the date set for the next step in this trial, the penalty phase. The same jury that sat here for nearly 5 months and that found Chase guilty and sane will now decide whether he lives in a state prison or dies in the state gas chamber. The judge can overrule a death penalty verdict if he wishes.
Number 2. Albert Fish. Grace Budd, Delia Flanagan's daughter, had been missing for over 6 years. In November of 1934, she would receive the most disturbing anonymous letter any parent could ever imagine. The letter read, "Dear Miss Budd, on Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. Made up my mind to eat her." Little did Delia know that her daughter had fallen victim to one of the most disgusting humans to ever exist, Albert Fish. Due to his horrific crimes, he's been called many names over the years, such as the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Moon Maniac, the Gray Man, and the real-life Boogeyman. He was slender and harmless, but his deceiving appearance hid the monster that lived within. Albert Fish was born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., to Randall and Ellen Fish. From the outset, he was born into a dysfunctional family plagued by mental illness. His father, aged 75, and his mother, aged 32, had a significant age gap between them. Despite having 3 older siblings, young Fish spent most of his early years in an orphanage, as his parents had abandoned him at a tender age. Additionally, he couldn't stay with other relatives due to their own mental health issues. His mother experienced hallucinations, while his sister, brother, and uncle were diagnosed with various forms of mental afflictions, a term used at the time to cover a range of mental illnesses, given the limited understanding of mental health and its treatment during that era. While at the orphanage, Fish was subjected to a variety of physical and mental abuse from both his peers and caretakers. He endured regular beatings and sadistic torture from other boys, which he later recounted in detail. Strangely, Fish admitted that he began to develop a liking for these beatings, even deriving pleasure from them as a means of coping with the appalling conditions. In his own words, Fish stated, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." By 1880, Fish's mother had secured a stable enough job to finally remove him from the orphanage. A couple years later, at the age of 12, he developed a relationship with a young boy. This boy had mental health issues of his own, and together they began to drink urine and eat feces for pleasure. He also developed a weird fantasy in which he visited public bathhouses to watch other men undress. As his bizarre behavior progressed, he began to write vile and disgusting letters to women that he found in classified ads. As Fish matured, he relocated to New York City in 1890 at the age of 20. There, he became a prostitute and took a disgusting interest in underage boys. Even with all his strange behaviors, his mother arranged a marriage for him in which he would father 6 children. And while they led a normal life for a while, his children recounted how their father would sometimes ask them to play sadistic games, often wanting them to spank him with a paddle filled with nails until he bled. He recounted how he became obsessed with sexual mutilation after seeing dissected genitals at a wax museum and wanted to experiment himself. Eventually, Fish would start seeing a man secretly, and his spiral into darkness continued. In 1919, Fish met Thomas Kedden, a 19-year-old man who was intellectually disabled and lacked affection at home. Fish took advantage of Kedden and experimented his sadistic fantasies on him. Fish led Kedden to an abandoned barn where he tortured the young man for 2 weeks before eventually dissecting his genitals.
I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me,
Fish later recalled. His original plan was to kill Kedden, cut up his body, and take it home. However, he feared that the hot weather would draw undue attention to him. So, instead, he poured peroxide all over the wound and wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief. He left a $10 bill, bid Kedden goodbye, and as Fish would state later,
took first train I could get back home. Never heard what become of him or tried to find out.
By 1917, Fish's wife had had enough. She took everything they owned and left him for good. Following their separation, Fish began to experience auditory hallucinations and started experimenting with inserting needles into his abdomen and groin. An X-ray after his arrest showed an astounding 29 needles embedded in his groin. By now, Fish had reached a sadistic peak and began mutilating and murdering his victims, many of whom he wasn't officially charged for. One of these unfortunate victims was Francis McDonald. In 1924, Fish assaulted the 9-year-old boy and left him hanging from a tree. He stated that he wanted to castrate the boy but didn't have enough time. A second victim was Billy Gaffney, who in 1927 was kidnapped from his home in Brooklyn. Fish took the child to Riker Avenue dumps, tied his hands and feet, and then gagged his mouth with a dirty rag. He flogged him until blood streamed down his legs, then disfigured his ears, nose, and mouth. Unfortunately, Gaffney also didn't survive Fish's onslaught, and when the boy finally passed away, Fish took parts of him home to cook and consume him. Finally, Fish's last victim would be 10-year-old Grace Budd. In 1928, Fish responded to a newspaper ad placed by Grace Budd's brother, Edward, who was seeking employment. Initially intending to murder Edward, Fish changed his plans upon meeting the Budd family and laid eyes on young Grace. Fish concocted a story about needing to attend his niece's birthday party and suggested that since Grace was the same age, she should join as well. He assured her parents that it would be no trouble for him to take her, and they agreed, a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Sadly, Grace was never seen again. In November 1934, the anonymous letter sent to Grace's parents ultimately led the police to Fish and would end his reign of terror. In the remainder of his letter, he went on to describe terrible, unthinkable things that he did to poor Grace. While the rest of the contents of the letter are too graphic to share, he ultimately detailed how he strangled, dismembered, and then ate her body over the course of multiple days. Police discovered a peculiar symbol and abbreviation on the letter's envelope, which led them to a company named the New York Private Shelfers Benevolent Association. Investigators interviewed a janitor who worked for the company and confessed to taking several envelopes of similar type back to his rented room, though he abandoned them upon moving out. Upon further investigation with the building's landlord, they learned that Fish had moved in just days later. Detective William King, the chief investigator on the case, waited outside until Fish finally returned, arresting him on December 13, 1934. Albert Fish claimed he had as many as 100 victims, even bragging that he had children in every state. He would go on to confess about how he carefully selected victims he believed people wouldn't miss, stating that African American boys and intellectually disabled children were his main targets. Fish also confessed to using various methods to commit his heinous acts, including a butcher's knife, meat cleaver, handsaw, and other tools which he referred to as the implements of hell. His trial for Grace Budd's murder began in 1935, and while his attorneys argued that he was criminally insane, the jurors still insisted on the death penalty for his horrific crimes. Albert Fish was finally executed by the electric chair in 1936. While his execution can never undo his horrible deeds, it at least provided some closure to the victims' families. He's even been the subject of the 2011 film The Gray Man, and his horrific crimes solidify his place as one of the most disturbing killers in history. And that's a wrap for today's episode. Please share any thoughts in the comments below and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. This is Josh, and thank you for watching Bizarre Legends.